All right. So, we're diving deep today into whiskey maturation.
Okay.
And, you've always been so curious about how those, complex flavors develop.
Right.
And I think the source material that you shared is really going to help break this down for us today. So
Yeah.
peeking behind the curtain to see how that, liquid gold transforms in the barrel.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head.
Right.
Maturation, that's where whiskey truly finds its voice.
Okay. So it's not just about, time, right? It's
Right.
more like this magical interaction happening inside the barrel.
Yeah, exactly. It's a beautiful slow dance between the whiskey and its surroundings.
Okay.
Think of it this way. There are 3 core changes happening.
Okay.
Inside that oak cask,
Mm-hmm.
wood interaction,
Okay.
oxidation,
Okay.
and evaporation.
Okay. Let's unpack this a little bit.
Sure.
Wood interaction.
Okay.
That sounds kind of, self-explanatory.
Yeah,
Tell me more.
It's almost like the whiskey is drawing flavors directly from the wood itself, like a sponge,
Okay.
absorbing flavors.
Yeah.
Then there's oxidation, where the whiskey breathes a bit
Okay.
through the wood,
Mm-hmm.
mellowing out any harsh edges and developing a smoother character.
Okay.
Imagine leaving a sliced apple out.
Right.
It interacts with the air, right?
Yeah.
Changing color and flavor.
Right.
That's oxidation at work.
Okay.
And finally, we have evaporation,
Okay.
the so-called angel's share.
Ah, yes. The angels share.
Precisely.
A little something for the heavens.
Yes, as some of that whiskey evaporates, it concentrates the flavors that remain, making them more intense and complex over time.
I'm already captivated.
Good.
But let's go back to the wood interaction for a second.
Okay.
You said the whiskey pulls flavors from the wood itself.
Yes.
But what kind of wood are we talking about here?
Right.
Isn't all oak created equal?
That is a great question. And you're right, not all oak is the same.
Okay.
While there are, various options, the most common types you'll encounter are American oak and European oak, each with its own personality.
So American oak versus European oak, what are the main differences in the flavors they bring to the party?
It's all about subtlety versus boldness.
Okay.
American oak tends to be the life of the party, bringing those bright notes of vanilla caramel and even a hint of coconut. It's what gives bourbon its characteristic sweetness.
Okay.
On the other hand, European oak is the intriguing guest with a taste for the finer things.
Okay.
Think rich, spicy flavors like dried fruits, nuts, and a whisper of cinnamon.
That's incredible. So when I taste those vanilla notes in a bourbon, that's the American oak singing.
It is.
And the spiciness in, say, a scotch, that's the European oak.
Precisely.
Interesting. Okay.
And here's where it gets even more interesting. Within the realm of European oak, sherry casks are incredibly popular, especially for aging scotch.
I've definitely noticed sherry cask on a lot of scotch labels.
Right.
What's so special about them?
They were previously used to age sherry,
Okay.
which is a fortified wine, and they absorb those wonderful, intense flavors.
Okay.
So imagine those rich, nutty, almost dried fruit flavors of sherry seeping into the whiskey
Wow.
during maturation.
Okay.
It creates a beautiful complexity and depth.
Interesting.
And here's why it's so perfect with scotch.
Okay.
Scotch tends towards malty, sometimes smoky flavors. The sherry casks, dried fruit notes, think raisins and figs, complement those flavors beautifully,
Wow.
creating a harmonious taste experience.
It's like pairing a fine wine with a delicious meal.
Yes.
But in this case, the wine barrel IS part of the meal.
Exactly.
Now, you also mentioned port casks earlier.
Yes.
Tell me more about those.
Port casks.
Yeah.
These bring a whole other dimension to the table.
Okay.
Having previously held port wine, picture this fruity, almost jammy flavors with notes of berries, plums, and a luxurious sweetness.
Wow.
They could even give the whiskey a beautiful reddish hue.
Wait, really?
Yeah,
You can actually see the impact of the cask on the whiskey's color.
absolutely.
That's wild.
It's like the cask is leaving its fingerprint on the spirit,
Wow.
both in terms of flavor and appearance.
Okay.
And it's not just limited to sherry and port. Distilleries are experimenting with all sorts of wine and spirit casks.
Really?
Reduire sauternes, even rum barrels to create unique and exciting flavor profiles.
Wow. It's like stepping into a world of flavor possibilities. I'm already imagining myself, on this whiskey tasting adventure trying to decipher all these influences. But, it makes you wonder, with all this talk about casks imparting flavor, what happens to the cask itself after it's been used?
Right.
Is it a one and done situation, or does the cask get to have a second life?
Those casks are practically bursting with flavor. It would be a shame to retire them after just one use. Reusing casks is a common practice,
Okay.
and it adds another layer of intrigue to the final whiskey.
Okay, color me intrigued. Walk me through this cask reincarnation process. How does reusing a cask change the flavor profile of the whiskey?
Okay, so imagine a brand new oak cask,
Okay.
fresh from holding, say, bourbon or sherry.
Mm-hmm.
That cask is like a flavor bomb ready to explode. We call this a first fill cask.
Okay.
And when whiskey goes into a first fill cask,
Yeah.
you can expect a flavor explosion.
Wow.
Those wood sugars, the spices, everything is super concentrated. It's like the difference between freshly brewed coffee
Okay.
and a second cup from the same pot.
That makes sense. The first cup is always the most intense. So what happens when you use a cask for a second or third round?
Yeah.
Does it lose its flavor power?
It does mellow out, a bit like that second cup of coffee.
Okay.
These refill casks, as they're called, might not have the same intensity as a first fill,
Right.
but they still hold a symphony of subtle flavors. They allow the whiskey's own unique character to take center stage,
Okay.
gently influenced by the cask's history.
It's like the cask is whispering its stories instead of shouting them. That's fascinating. Are there any specific examples of whiskeys that showcase this refill cask character particularly well?
Absolutely.
No?
One that comes to mind is Glenmorangie the Original.
Oh.
It's known for its delicate floral notes,
Oh.
and a lot of that comes from the fact that it's primarily matured in refill American oak casks.
Interesting.
Those casks have already given their most intense flavors to previous batches, allowing the whiskey's inherent fruitiness and subtle sweetness to shine through.
That's a great tip. I'll have to keep an eye out for the original next time I'm exploring Scotch. So we've got first fill refill. Is that it for the cask's journey?
Not necessarily.
Mm.
This is where things get really interesting with a technique called finishing.
Finishing. Like
Yeah.
adding the final brushstroke to a masterpiece.
Exactly. Imagine a whiskey that spent years maturing in, let's say, an American oak bourbon barrel.
Okay.
It's developed a lovely base character. Then, for the final few months or years, the distiller moves it to a completely different cask, maybe a sherry or port cask, to add an extra layer of complexity.
It's like sending the whiskey on a little vacation to soak up some new culture and flavors.
Precisely. And just like traveling to a new place can broaden your horizons, that final finishing period can dramatically enhance the whiskey's flavor profile. For example, a whiskey finished in a Pedro Ximénez, Casks, sherry cask will develop rich, decadent notes of dark chocolate-dried fruits and spices, transforming it into a truly luxurious experience.
I never knew there was so much strategy involved. It's incredible how distillers use these techniques to create such a diverse range of flavors. It's like they're conducting an orchestra of flavors with each cask playing a specific part. But I'm curious, besides the cask type, what other factors come into play during maturation? We've touched upon time, but what about the environment where the whiskey is stored? Does that impact the final product as well? You're absolutely right. We've talked about the cask type and even how many times the cask has been used. But what about the surrounding environment?
Yeah.
Does that play a role in how a whiskey matures?
It's a huge factor.
Yeah.
Think of it like this: whiskey aging is like a slow dance,
Okay.
and the environment sets the tempo.
Okay.
Warmer climates like Kentucky, where they make bourbon, really speed up the dance.
Oh, what?
The whiskey interacts with the wood more quickly, drawing out those bold flavors in a shorter amount of time.
So that's why bourbons often have those big vanilla and caramel notes.
Exactly.
Even with younger ages.
Exactly. Now imagine that same dance in the Scottish Highlands, where it's cool and misty.
Okay.
The whiskey takes its time maturing at a more leisurely pace.
Right.
That slow, gentle interaction creates a more nuanced, complex flavor profile
Okay.
over a longer period.
So a Scotch aged in the Highlands might have similar wood notes to a bourbon, but they'll be more integrated.
Yes.
Subtler.
You got it. And it's not just about heat. Humidity plays a role, too.
Okay.
Higher humidity can actually slow down evaporation, meaning less angel share,
Right.
and a slightly heavier mouthfeel in the final whiskey.
This is mind-blowing. I never realized how much geography influences the final product.
Yeah.
It's like each bottle of whiskey carries a little piece of its environment within it.
It truly is a taste of place. And for a whiskey enthusiast like yourself, understanding these nuances adds a whole new dimension to the tasting experience.
Speaking of tasting, with all this talk about casks and climates, I'm starting to get a real thirst for knowledge and maybe a dram or two.
Sure.
But how do we take all this amazing information and apply it to our own whiskey journey?
That's the fun part. Start by thinking about the flavors you naturally enjoy.
Okay.
Do you have a bit of a sweet tooth?
Mm-hmm.
Look for whiskeys aged in American oak or finished in port casks. If you crave something rich and spicy, European oak and sherry casks might be your calling. It's all about connecting your palate to the maturation process.
So it's like having a secret decoder ring for whiskey labels.
Yes.
Instead of just seeing 12-year-old single malt,
Hmm.
I can start to imagine the flavors based on the cask type and region.
Precisely. And as you taste more whiskeys, you'll start to pick up on those nuances even more.
Okay.
You'll discover that a Highland Scotch aged in ex-bourbon barrels has a totally different personality than an Islay whiskey aged in sherry casks, even if they both spent the same amount of time maturing.
This has been such an eye-opening journey into the heart of whiskey maturation. It's amazing how much complexity and artistry goes into every bottle.
And the best part is, this is just the beginning. There's a whole world of whiskey out there for you to explore.
So to our listeners, the next time you raise a glass of whiskey, take a moment to appreciate the journey it's been on. Think about the type of cask, the climate it matured in, and how those factors have come together to create the symphony of flavors you're experiencing. Happy tasting.